Public discourse is saturated with missile defense. Contracts are awarded, like the Missile Defense Agency's SHIELD program, reinforcing a kinetic, skyward-facing threat perception. This is a calculated diversion. The focus on high-cost interceptors is a systemic liability designed to bankrupt the defender while ignoring the true vector of attack. The blueprint for strategic collapse is not a launch sequence. It is silence. Consider Berlin, which recently suffered its longest blackout since World War II. The cause was not a hypersonic missile, it was a deliberate arson attack on ground infrastructure. This is the model. Low cost, high impact, asymmetric warfare targeting systemic fragility. Extrapolate this to a global scale. CSIS analysis confirms that 99% of all intercontinental data, financial transactions, military communications, logistical data, travels through a few hundred undersea fiber optic cables. They are the central nervous system of the global economy. They're also alarmingly vulnerable, a fact well documented in RUSI threat assessments. This creates the blind Leviathan protocol, a state with unparalleled kinetic force, carriers, stealth bombers, satellite grids, is rendered inert the moment you sever its data connectivity. A Leviathan, blinded and deafened, does not become passive. Its doctrine, its very wiring, dictates a launch-on warning posture. With its eyes gouged out, it escalates kinetically to compensate, transforming its conventional strength into an accelerant for global strategic exchange. The silence is the trigger. Wars of ideology are a 20th century luxury. Modern conflict is a solvency event. A state initiates kinetic action not from a position of strength, but to manage a systemic internal collapse. The motive is not expansion. It is a desperate attempt to restructure its own balance sheet before an inevitable default. CSIS analysis of Russia's mobilization provides the blueprint. A prolonged, unpopular kinetic war becomes a terminal domestic liability. It drains liquidity and political capital, threatening the regime itself. When the cost of conventional force exceeds the state's solvency, the entire strategic framework must pivot. It is a mathematical function, not a political choice. This is not a uniquely foreign vulnerability. The West's internal fragility is a documented liability. According to MSN, U.S. families alone now carry a record $18.6 trillion in debt. This systemic leverage against the state itself is the primary target for any adversary conducting rational economic warfare. The foundation is already compromised. Weakness forces the pivot to asymmetry. A state facing a solvency crisis cannot afford a symmetric response. An adversary understands this. They will not target an F-35, they will target a power transformer. The deliberate arson attack that caused Berlin's longest blackout since World War II is the operational model. For a minimal kinetic cost, an adversary can exploit critical infrastructure vulnerability and force a disproportionately expensive, systemic, and politically catastrophic response from a fragile state. The entire strategic equation has been inverted by a single brutal economic reality. Analysts at RUSI calculate the kinetic cost. A modern main battle tank, a $5 million asset, can now be neutralized by a $500 first-person view drone. This is a 10,000 to 1 cost imbalance. It's not warfare, it's arbitrage. This is the liquidation of conventional military hardware at pennies on the dollar. This systemic leverage is what we call the democratization of violence. The barrier to entry for projecting lethal state-level force has collapsed. While a legacy power is consumed by its own internal solvency crisis, servicing record levels of debt, an adversary can field thousands of these asymmetric threats. It forces the defender into an economically unsustainable posture. For every cheap threat launched, the defender must deploy countermeasures that cost orders of magnitude more. This mathematical imbalance creates a predictable protocol. Unable to win the economic attrition war, the defender is incentivized to escalate kinetically, to strike the source. The adversary, fully aware of the fragility of Western infrastructure like Germany's power grid, uses this predictable response as the primary vector to trigger a wider, uncontainable conflict. Conventional strength becomes the accelerant. The primary theater of operations is no longer a physical location. It is a mathematical model. Adversaries probe, not for territorial gain, but for systemic breakpoints. Regions experiencing unusual instability are not the source of the conflict. They are laboratories. CSIS refers to these as proxy laboratories, live fire environments for testing low-cost, high-impact attack vectors against Western-style infrastructure and social cohesion. The blueprint was recently validated in Germany. A deliberate arson attack resulted in Berlin's longest blackout since World War II. The critical data point is not the outage itself, but the cost-benefit ratio. A negligible investment by the attacker yielded a systemic shock to the core of Europe's largest economy, exposing the extreme vulnerability of its infrastructure. This model is designed for a primary target whose primary liability is its own balance sheet. The United States household sector now carries a record $18.6 trillion in debt. This isn't a domestic economic issue, it is a national security liability of the highest order. A state with a terminal solvency crisis cannot withstand a sustained campaign of infrastructure attrition. The math is zero-sum. The objective of a gray zone probe is to force the defender into a predictable, financially ruinous response, kinetic escalation. This response is not only anticipated, it is monetized. The announcement of a major missile defense shield contract, such as the one awarded to Tetra Tech, serves as a public price list for adversaries. It tells them exactly how to convert a low-cost attack into a billion-dollar liability for the target state, accelerating its fiscal collapse. The strategic consequence is the destabilization of legacy alliances. According to reports from the Forward, a quiet but monumental diplomatic shift is already underway in the Middle East. When a global power is perceived as fiscally brittle and vulnerable to low-cost paralysis, its security guarantees are repriced as liabilities. Allies do not leave out of malice. They disengage as a matter of pure risk management. This is not a failure of diplomacy. It is a feature of systemic decay. The launch on warning protocol is a systemic tripwire. According to analysts at CSIS, the doctrine dictates that a nuclear-armed state launches its retaliatory strike the moment its early warning systems detect an incoming attack. The objective is to prevent one's own arsenal from being destroyed in its silos. This creates a mathematical certainty. The decision window is measured in minutes, not hours. The true asymmetric vector, however, is not a missile, but a signal. A hostile cyber attack can blind command and control radar and satellite feeds, creating what strategists term the fog of digital war. In this state of induced blindness, the commander faces a zero-sum choice. Is the data loss a system failure, or is it the blinding flash before a decapitation strike? To wait for confirmation is to risk total annihilation. To launch is to risk a global strategic exchange based on a phantom. The adversary doesn't need to fire a missile. They only need to make you believe they did. The mathematical framework is set. A state with compromised internal solvency, evidenced by record family debt burdens of $18.6 trillion, cannot absorb a systemic shock. Its economic fragility becomes a liability on the strategic balance sheet. This incentivizes a low-cost, high-impact probe by an adversary. The blueprint for this probe has already been beta tested. The deliberate arson attack that triggered Berlin's longest blackout since World War II is not an isolated incident. It is a proof of concept. CSIS and RAUSI have documented the extreme vulnerability of Western civil infrastructure. The objective is not destruction, but the calibration of response. The calibration shot will occur within 12 months. Expect a cascading, multi-day blackout targeting a Tier 1 U.S. data center cluster in Ashburn, Virginia. The event will be officially attributed to catastrophic equipment failure or domestic sabotage, mirroring the Berlin playbook. The true purpose is to measure the mobilization timeline of the U.S. kinetic response to a non-military attribution impossible attack. It is a test to see how fast a nation drowning in debt will reach for its sword.